During a Reddit AMA, Team Cherry developers once went on record saying Hollow Knight has no lore, a game in which I've edited many videos on and spent at least a good couple months developing a lore series for, apparently ends up having little meaning, at least in the linear sense. There is no established lore outside of what is obvious. The Radiance, the Old Light, once ruled Hallownest and preferred its bugs to be primal slave minds, part of one cohesive hive of bugs. And then along came the Worm, a supposedly ancient being of immense power and unfathomable wisdom. Reincarnated into the Pale King, he coveted the Radiance's throne and planned to seize it. The Pale King succeeded and became the new monarch of Hallownest, but only for a short time, and with great consequence. The Radiance manifests itself in this yucky orange infection you see overtaking much of the kingdom. That is at least the overarching story in a nutshell, but according to Team Cherry, at least according to what they provided us with in this AMA, that's really as far as it goes. Since then, this game has garnered a following that theorizes whether or not the lore hidden in the game's crannies could actually be strung together in a way that makes sense. Hornet's ties with the Deep Nest, the mysterious tablet in the archives, and the purpose of the Grim Troop have all been picked apart and scrutinized for bits of lore. The reason this game held such a special place in my heart for such a long time was because Hollow Knight, at its core, is more than that. Hollow Knight's ultimate moral, its one major takeaway that players are expected to ponder over, is something that the lore itself will not give you. Hollow Knight takes advantage of a particular style of exploration in which the player visits this long-forgotten and ancient ruin, and pieces together the timeline of what exactly happened using what's hidden in the decrepit world. It's a pretty common trope, arguably as old as video games themselves, and what we eventually find is one of the cornerstone reasons why the Radiance and Pale King seemed such at odds. While the Radiance preferred the bugs of Hallownest function as servants, with nothing above primal instinct to rely on, the Pale King desired to give the bugs knowledge and open-mindedness, two endgames from two different rulers that could not be more opposite of each other. The Pale King took the bugs' hive-minded primal nature and gave them sentience and universal awareness, which he would soon learn was not without consequence. And from this conflict forms the age-old traditional motif of light opposing dark, or in this instance, soul opposing void. But in a sense, it's basically the same thing. When looked at from a distance, Hollow Knight seems a very simple game. You have two elements that control basically everything, light and dark. Simple, easy to follow, pretty transparent for the most part, but when we get closer and observe the lore of Hallownest, we also find that this dark energy is called the Void. And this energy, in fact, is actually the main ingredient the Pale King used to make the vessel that you are playing as. And with this information, we also discover the light, or soul, is an attribute of life. We know this because your vessel siphons soul from its enemies when striking and killing them. And so these two motifs, light and dark, become something else, soul and void. While one personifies life and vacancy, the other represents emptiness and nothingness. But we can go even further if we wanted. If you grinded it out and toiled for the true ending of Hollow Knight, well, you noticed the achievement Void, which requires remembering the past and uniting the void of the abyss with the life of the world above. Your vessel takes the king's soul from the White Palace and comes to terms with the nature of his existence by dream-nailing himself and taking a look at his past memories. Your vessel witnesses the creation of the Hollow Knight, and in doing so, witnesses the process of his own creation as well, and the darkness behind it. In a sense, this is your vessel coming to terms with the circumstances of his creation, and his accepting of the reality of death. Once we discover this, the final level of depth has been achieved, and we ultimately discover that Hollow Knight is not a game of light and dark, nor a game of life and emptiness, but instead the miracle of birth against the inevitability of death. Alright, so pause. I know I lost at least someone in all of that existentialist bullshit, so let me back up and walk you down my process of thought and the reasons I have for believing this really is what Hollow Knight is supposed to be. All of this philosophy begins with Gigi the Confessor. When you die and leave behind a shade, another option is to give any ranted eggs you have to Gigi, and she will conjure up this shade with all your geo and resources. This service is extremely useful if you died in a difficult spot that you don't think you can reach without risk of dying again. And you can travel back to Gigi with the Rancid Egg, and she will retrieve this shade for you. Gigi talks a lot about regret, the manner of dealing with these regrets and coming to terms with our shortcomings. Gigi's dialogue was far too deep and far too existential for me to just dismiss it and assume it had no significance, so I started to search further, and my search led me to the Hunter's Journal, particularly the final journal entry having to do with the shade creatures you fight in the Abyss and become if you die. Each of us leaves an imprint of something when we die, a stain on the world. I don't know how much longer this kingdom can bear the weight of so many past lives. This, in short, is Hollow Knight's way of depicting ghosts. It has long been a paranormal theory that when a person dies, their regrets are what keep them tied to their current world and prevent them from moving on. And so these regrets manifest into an apparition, or in Hollow Knight's case, a shade. Shades, much like what we perceive as ghosts, are metaphysical embodiments of these regrets. And suddenly, Gigi's dialogue starts to make a little more sense. The void, in short, is a substance meant to personify the natural human condition of regret and dealing with failure. We also have the two charms, King Soul and Void Heart, to discuss, because I believe these two charms also have heavy significance when talking about the philosophy of Hollow Knight, but we will get there in a minute. We know from arcane eggs and soul totems, there is enough evidence to support the existence of a kingdom before Hallownest. Both the soul and void energies are pretty archaic, and they've both been around for an extremely long time, or at least far before Hallownest was ever created. These two energies seem to be at odds with each other, but that's actually not the case at all. The energy of soul and of void actually cooperate with each other and complement each other quite a lot, and that's all because of vessels like you. These vessels, Hollow Knights, are conduits of both soul and void energy, and is proof that these two energies were meant to work together. It's why upgrading your spells requires you to find the darker half of each soul power. Desolate Dive becomes Descending Dark, Vengeful Spirit becomes Shade Soul, and so on. In fact, the third ability, Howling Wraiths, is even used to obtain the spell's void-like counterpart, Abyss Shriek. As a result, your vessel harnesses both light and dark, and the strength of these spells become twofold. As evidenced by these vessels being able to manipulate both energies at will, these two concepts are not dichotomous, and if anything, are separated in the universe when they really shouldn't be. The whole point of the true ending, after all, is to achieve complete unity by consuming the radiance and to be rid of the infection once and for all. The true ending itself doesn't even show you destroying the radiance, but rather it seems as though you're consuming it and unifying it with the void energy where it should be, which ultimately spells the end of the infection. This leads me to believe that the two energies, though once together and part of the same whole, somehow became separated and thrown into a malignant unrest. And here's where the two charms come in, King Soul and Void Heart. Despite these technically being two separate charms, one is required for the other, and they are actually really the same. Only difference is one is the darkened byproduct of a void-like metamorphosis after being exposed to the true nature of the vessel's creation. The King Soul eventually becomes the Void Heart during this reconciliation. Now, the two halves of the King Soul charm are retrieved from the White Lady in the Queen's Gardens and the throne of the Pale King in the White Palace. The game heavily insinuates that these two higher beings were the owners of this charm, and, much like the vessels the king created, could channel its power to manipulate and bend soul energy. It's important to remember that these are actually the same charm, and the charm's darker form is not discovered until right after your vessel realizes the true nature of his creation, and decides to let the darkness inside him willfully, rather than fight against it. And all the shades that once haunted you before no longer seem to bother you. The void tendrils erupting from the abyss lakes no longer grab you, and the darkness you once fought against seems to be at peace. All of this is extremely significant, and it's why Hollow Knight is ultimately a game about life and death. As we've already covered, the darkness of the void is of great contrast to the light. Whereas the light foreshadowed the worm's reincarnation and the birth of a newer, more civilized Hallownest, the void symbolizes the regrets that we may hang on to upon meeting deathly circumstances. The unification of these two energies, triggered by the vessel's acceptance of his nature, also allegorizes the acceptance of mortality and coming to terms with our inevitable death by making peace with the things in our past that make us remorseful and contrite. As large of a philosophy as it sounds, this is not a new concept either. The Dark Souls games deals with this same sort of ideologue, where the only fact of life is indeed the death that comes after it. And Hollow Knight, in its simplest and most philosophical form, is only a retelling of this same commentary. How two seemingly separable units of life need to be unified in order for us to appreciate our mortality. We must understand the miracle of birth, just as we must eventually come to terms with the reality of death. For a game with supposedly no lore, Hallownest has one of the most scintillating commentaries on existentialism and the human condition that I've probably ever found, at least recently. It takes the simple dichotomy of light against dark and transforms it into something with a much greater story to tell. It's simply insane to me that we're 16 months into this game's release and there are still things like this hidden within the walls of the game that haven't yet been discovered. Hollow Knight is basically one existential crisis manifested into a game about talking bugs and worms. Definitely not the game I was expecting it to be. Anyways, thanks for tuning into The Forge, and please consider subscribing and give the bell a nice ring if you never want to miss a video again in the future. Thanks guys, I'll see you next time.